watch the on-screen chat box for an alternative call-in number. Please feel free to ask questions or provide feedback by using the chat box during the webinar. If you're using a tablet, you may feel the need to tap on the screen for the options bar to appear, and then you can select the appropriate option. We may not respond immediately, but we will work your questions or feedback into the presentation. If we can't get to your comment or questions during the session, we will be online afterwards to respond, or we may follow up in an email if we run completely out of time. You may also email us at moderator@aspenrmg.com for up to 48 hours after the webinar. This will be a 1-hour presentation. Questions and comments are very much encouraged throughout, and the presenters will be answering questions at the end. And lastly, we have more webinars coming up covering a variety of topics, including those listed at the Heffernan website. In addition, we offer the mandatory Preventing Harassment training in English 3 times a year. With that, let's begin today's webinar, Safety Leadership, Manager and Supervisor Responsibility and Accounting. Let me turn the presentation over while I introduce Kathy Marks, who will lead our interactive session today. Kathy Marks is a health, safety, insurance, and risk management consultant. She is a principal and president of risk management of Aspen Risk Management Group. She is also a principal and vice president of marketing of Ergo Healthy, a consulting firm that conducts office ergonomics assessments and solves ergonomic problems via online and telephone through its team of Ergo Healthy coaches. Kathy has served in risk and safety management positions for mid-sized companies, and she has spent time on both the carrier and insurance agency broker side of the business. Kathy has extensive training and experience in program content development and implementation, providing training programs to senior management, the broker community, insurance companies, risk managers, and employees. She has conducted trainings on numerous subjects, including OSHA 10-hour courses, and is one of 10 instructors nationwide authorized to teach the Certified Occupational Safety Specialist course. With that, I'd like to thank and welcome Kathy Marks.
Thank you, Deb. I appreciate that introduction, and welcome everyone to our webinar this morning. It is my pleasure to spend about an hour with you this morning and talking about our leadership responsibilities when it comes to safety and health for our employees. So again, I hope that you will find it interesting, and you'll have questions. Deb will be looking at the chat box, and I will try and pause in between breaths to ask if there are any questions as we move forward. So again, thank you very much. And of course, this is our typical disclaimer. This is really just intended to be an overview of employment practices. Certainly, every individual work state or work environment is different. It is up to you as the employer to understand your business, the rules, the regulations, the accountabilities for your particular industry. One of the things I do want to say at this point in the presentation is that when we talk about OSHA regulations, and believe me, it's not all about regulations and compliance. That is a huge part of what we do as safety leaders, is that OSHA will hold us accountable for the best practices of our industry. So although we will go ahead and present ideas and thoughts and program ideas, you really do need to understand what the best practices are of your industry. So joining associations and attending association meetings to know what others in your industry are doing are extremely important to make sure that you are up to date with OSHA regulations. So here's what I want to talk about, really in general. I want to talk about that every decision you make as a safety leader, and I don't care if your title says safety manager, safety coordinator, maybe it's just human resources manager, director, maybe it doesn't even have safety in the definition or in the job description. If you have one person that responds or reports to you, You are responsible for their safety. Once one person relies on you to understand the hazards of their job, you are really that safety coach and mentor. So every decision we make as safety leaders in our organization really falls into one of three buckets. It's a moral decision, number one. It's a legal decision because we have OSHA regulations that we have to follow. And it's a financial decision because we have to make sure that at the end of the day, we are controlling those costs that come from our company when it comes to accidents. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. So it's a moral, legal, and financial bucket that every decision we make falls into. I want to also talk a little bit about the difference between managing and leading. I feel that in the last couple of years, the word manager is kind of turned into a bad word. We're not a manager, we're leaders. Well, you know what? We're both. We have to manage as well as lead. So I want to talk about that a little bit. And understand at the end, I want to kind of review that in the world of safety, you're not just a leader. You're a coach, a mentor, a protector. You're the visionary when it comes to safety leadership. So if anything, I hope that at the end of our session together this morning that you will have a little renewed sense of oomph, if you will, when it comes to safety. Don't think that it's another hat you have to wear. Safety is a huge responsibility, and certainly as our employees' lives depend on us, it can be very exciting. It is a great responsibility that we have, but hopefully it'll give you that that feeling that you really are making a difference, not only in your company's life, if you will, but of that of your employee. So again, here it is. What is our ultimate purpose of safety leadership? Well, as a leader in your organization, at the end of the day, you are saving lives. You are preventing injuries and illnesses, and you are keeping your company from financial harm. That's it. It's that simple. When we look at the moral, legal, financial obligation, which is how I've broken up the presentation today, that's really how it falls into, and that is our obligation. And I'm just going to say, before I forget, I have been doing this for a long time. Over 30 years. I started my career in the Coast Guard. I was reservist at the Concord Naval Weapons Station. I worked with explosives and hazardous materials. I was responsible for the ship's crew, and the community to make sure that everybody was safe. And you know what? At the end of the day, that's what it's all about, to make sure that our employees go home in the same shape that they came to work in. And I truly believe that most employees, 96, 97%, want to put food on the table for their families, clothes on their kids' back. Unfortunately, those in our organizations that do kind of have a tendency of being, if you will, professional injured, get all of our attention. But most employees want to do the right thing, want to follow rules, and want to come to work every day. So Deb, I'm going to ask this first polling question, or I guess you will, and here's our slide.
Sure. While I launch the poll is, how long has OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, been in place? And while you're answering that question, I'd like to encourage anybody that has other questions to please use the chat box. We would love to be able to respond to your interest during this webinar. So I'll be looking at the chat box to make sure that we get to your questions. Okay, we still have a few people left to vote. Still voting. There's some good guessing going on out there. So, all right, we've got almost 80%. So, Kathy, 13% of the people say 100 years. 36% of the people say 50 years. 21% of the participants say 35 years. And 30% of the participants say 46 years.
All right. Well, for those, and I kind of switched it up on you a little bit, Deb. I realized I needed to update it. Those of you that said 46, it's actually 47, so you were really close. OSHA didn't start until 1970. 1970. Good old President Nixon, one of the good things that he did was he actually passed OSHA. And when we think about our parents, our grandparents, unless they worked in a mine, because the Mine Safety and Health Act started about 1910, there were no workplace safety rules for our parents, our grandparents. For some of us who might have started working before 1970, there were no specific laws for us, so it's still fairly new. And in general, we had a lot of catching up to do when OSHA was started in 1970. I love this quote from the Secretary of Labor from 1968. And the Secretary of Labor said, "People can't see the blood on the food that they eat, on the things that they buy, and on the services they get." And you know, I think this really applies when we think about these hurricanes that have affected the country the last several weeks. And I just heard that a citizen was electrocuted with some down power lines, and everyone wants their power up. Well, you know what? There are workers out there that are out in the storms that are fixing sewer lines and power lines, and we forget as consumers that's a mom, a dad, a grandfather, a grandmother who's out there in bucket trucks, in the wind, in hurricanes. All we say is, "I want clean water, I want my power." But there's a human behind that. And for those of you that are in companies that make these, make widgets, that make clean water, that make products, our consumers don't really understand what it took for that product to be made. But you understand. And so I love this quote because it really does say a lot about safety. Just real briefly, I love this journey of safety. It was given to me by one of my students in one of my classes. And I think as safety leaders, it's important for us to kind of understand the journey of where we've been and where we're going. Because OSHA started in 1970, we had a whole bunch of regulations, not even as many as we have now. Of course, they're added as the last 47 years have passed. In the first 10 years, we were very regulatory oriented. We were reactive. We had, oh my gosh, our goal was zero non-compliance. We knew that we were successful if we didn't get any citations and fines, and our tools were looking at these rules, looking at these regulations. 10 years later in the 80s, we were looking at, well, okay, now let's look at total quality management, the Deming principle, employee surveys. And now instead of saying our goal is zero non-compliance, we started saying our goal was zero injuries. If we have no injuries, we must have a successful safety program. And we monitored and based our success on our injury rates, our audit findings, our tools. We're now training and investigations. Well, in the 90s, now we had 20 years under our belt of rules and regulations in OSHA. We started seeing that loss trends, injury trends, were really based on behavior, that the majority of injuries were not caused by things, but were caused by unsafe behavior. So we started looking at behavior psychology. We were able to be more proactive, anticipating what could hurt our employees versus being reactive. And then we started saying, look, if 80 to 85% of injuries are caused by unsafe behaviors, why don't we then start monitoring and changing our goals to counting percent safe behaviors? So I'm going to stop here right now. I'm going to talk about if any of you have incentive programs or goals that you tell your employees, our goal is zero injuries. Our goal is that if nobody has any injuries in the next quarter, we're going to have a barbecue where everybody gets $10 for every week that they don't have an injury. Well, OSHA has gotten very smart, and OSHA has determined that these types of incentive programs or celebrations based on zero injuries could be incentivizing non-reporting of injuries. And they are really not happy with that, and I agree with it. We never want to incentivize non-reporting of injuries. So since we've known since the 90s that it's unsafe behaviors that really are driving injuries, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what an unsafe behavior is. Why don't we say, hey, if we catch 20 employees being safe in the first quarter, 30 employees being safe in the second quarter, if we have an increase by 5% of employee suggestions or 10% in participation in training, then we'll have our celebration, right? So we're celebrating the positives, which actually reflect preventing injuries versus the zero injuries. So that goes into growing safe people, looking at our behaviors and our words and our actions. And now our measurement, instead of zero injuries, is now safe behaviors. Now we're looking at accountability. And I want you to know that just because you're a manager or supervisor, it's not all on you. OSHA does hold employees accountable for their safe behaviors. We're looking at humanistic psychology. We're talking about safety expressed through our core values of our company. We've talked about safety culture for 30 years, but now we look at values. So I'm going to tell you two things. Don't want to repeat myself, but I may because I think it's really important. For those of you that have heard me speak before, if I ruled the world, I will never see another sign that says so many days without an injury, because to me, it's just so many days without a reported injury. Let's talk about so many safe behaviors we've looked at. And also that if I never see another sign that says safety is our number one priority, that would be wonderful, because priorities change, but values don't. I want to see signage that says safety is a value of our organization. And that is what's going to start sustaining your safety, accountability, and culture. So if you remember nothing else from this presentation, here are 5 points that I want you to think about as a safety leader. What is our role? Our role is to assess hazards and implement controls. What can hurt our employees, and what kind of controls do we have in place to prevent those injuries from occurring? To communicate and educate our employees. They have a right to know what can hurt them, whether or not it's a piece of equipment, whether or not it's a chemical. If they do get hurt, our job is to manage that injury case fairly and with sincere effort. Remember, employees want to put food on the table for their families. Our goal is to speak to an injured employee with respect and get them back to work as quickly as possible. That's it. Prevent them from getting hurt, communicate with them, talk to them with sincere effort and with managing the case fairly, getting them back to work. That's it. That's our job. Now, what does OSHA say our job is? Well, for those of you that are outside of California, in federal OSHA, federal OSHA has what's called the General Duty Clause. And the General Duty Clause is the basis of federal OSHA. And federal OSHA says, look, every employer shall furnish a place of employment that's free of recognized hazards, and here's the scary part, that are causing or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm. Remember, you should know your workplace, right? That's why it says are likely to cause death. You as the employer should have known that piece of equipment was dangerous, that chemical was dangerous. You have to furnish a place of employment where employees won't get hurt. Each employer shall comply with occupational safety and health standards. And look, each employee has to comply with the safety and health rules and the workplace safety rules where they work. So that's what federal OSHA says. Now, for those of you that are in California, we have our own set of OSHA rules that have to be as stringent or more stringent than Fed OSHA. Cal OSHA doesn't necessarily go by the General Duty Clause. They go by what's called the Injury and Illness Prevention Program. That was passed in 1991. It's got the 8 elements that says, 1, we have a safety program, we ensure compliance, we communicate safety, we do hazard inspections, we do accident investigations, we control hazards, and we train our employees. Bottom line is, whether you're Fed OSHA or Cal OSHA, we are held accountable for providing a safe and healthy workplace, identifying hazards before they could hurt our employees and controlling them. That's it. So, very easy. Deb, I have a second polling question.
Excellent. While I launch the polling question, Kathy, our audience is being unusually silent today. No questions have come in from the audience yet, so I may be assuming that we have a lot of really great safety experts out in the audience.
Sounds good.
Okay, the voting is continuing here. We'll give it another few moments. Okay, do your supervisors know of their personal responsibility to ensuring a safe and healthy workplace? Kathy, 92% of the audience says yes, and 8 to 9% say no.
All right. Well, thank you. And you know, I'm so glad to hear that, because OSHA, Cal OSHA, Fed OSHA, supervisors have a direct responsibility to understand the hazards that their employees are exposed to. In fact, OSHA says supervisors must be trained in the hazards of their employees' job duties. The idea being that if I have employees that drive forklifts, I better have training on record as their supervisor that I also attended forklift training, because OSHA says, how can I effectively supervise the safety and health of employees working on equipment that I have never been trained on myself? So that's perfect that they understand that they have a responsibility to ensure the safety and health of the employees that work for them. I do want to kind of update, for those of you that are in California, you probably have heard of the Bumblebee Tuna event that occurred. And for those of you out of California, I have been using this in my safety leadership class because I think this is really important. And although it's an extreme case, I think it's important for all of us to understand that we can be held personally responsible. Every state has some level of corporate Criminal Liability Act. For those of you that are not familiar with Bumblebee Tuna, in 2012, an employee, 25-year employee at Bumblebee Tuna in California, was unfortunately cooked to death in one of these, and the picture shows it's called a retort. It's actually a pressure cooker. It's about 35 feet long. There's a little track inside. The carts are filled with cans, and they're pressurized for about 2.5 hours in these retorts. At this particular location that Bumblebee had, the equipment was known to break down. This chain that pulls in these carts was broken, and an employee was inside the retort fixing this chain. Employees lost track of him, didn't know he was in there, pushed the carts in, and unfortunately 2.5 hours later when they found him, he was at the back of the retort, crushed between the carts and the back, and of course it was in a horrible, slow, agonizing death. In 2015, the case was settled with a $6 million fine to Bumblebee Tuna, and I don't have the exact breakdown. It was about $850,000 worth of fines. They also had about $700,000 worth of equipment upgrades. But the most important thing was that the operations manager and the safety manager were convicted as felons and held personally accountable for the death of this employee. And for those of you that work around machinery and equipment, this death was 100% preventable. They were cited specifically for 2 regulations: lockout, tagout, which means that if he was inside this retort, he should have locked out the circuit breaker, had that key in his pocket, so no one could have turned on that pressure cooker. And the second was confined space. This was a confined space. There was no one standing outside making sure to warn others that he was inside. And so they were convicted of felons. They were each fined about $20,000 each with 300 hours of community service. Once the fines are paid, once they finish their community service, they may be able to have that felony reduced to misdemeanors. But what that tells us is that there is a very low tolerance, of course, when there's an employee death. One thing is that both Fed OSHA and Cal OSHA does have a criminal investigation unit whenever there is a death to make sure, of course, that it wasn't intentional. This was not. This was a complete total accident that was 100% preventable. This, as an example, California has that Corporate Criminal Liability Act. Every state has one, and it's based on a reasonable person standard, the one that says really what would have a reasonable person known, or what should they have known regarding a serious hazard and existing a serious hazard, and are they willfully concealing a known serious danger. So This was the failure of the reasonable person test. A reasonable person would have fixed their equipment. A reasonable person would not have allowed a person to work at the end of a 35-foot dark retort when people are putting in cans of product in order to close that door and cook it. So that is kind of a wake-up call for all of us when it comes to our role and responsibility to make sure that we understand the hazards and we implement the controls. Because at the end of the day, safety has to be managed the way any other critical business function is managed. Cost factors, safety issues have a major bearing on the perception of our companies to the public. Who wants to be the new safety manager at Bumblebee now? What if you had good employees who, they may not want to work for a company that has had a history of serious deaths or injuries on the front page of the local paper? Are we going to be able to recruit the talent that we want if we have a poor safety history? Because that's all public knowledge. So we as safety leaders have to convince management that safety is a good business practice, not just because it's morally the right thing to do, but from a marketing perspective and for a business health perspective. Can we recruit, retain, and get the people we want if we have a poor safety record? So at the end of the day, safety is a value. It has to be internally driven by you, by senior management from the very top, and it's a value with no compromise. And here's the way it works. A true safety culture is led by you, men and women, because it's the right thing to do, not solely for compliance. We have to know OSHA. We have to know the rules and regulations. But you know what? After doing this for 30 years, I always tell my clients, you know what? Let's do it because it's the right thing to do. Let's correct this because someone could get hurt and not take care of their families. Yes, I can throw out a regulation to you, but let's just do it because it's the right thing to do. That's going to certainly help morale as well. Because when we think about it, what does a safety leader look like, right? A safety leader is going to have the best interests of their employees at heart. So if we were in person, I would ask you, what's the difference between managing and leading? Right? What are the characteristics of a good safety leader that you have had in your life? And we would flip chart it. So I'm going to move ahead. But again, as I talked about, don't be a manager, be a leader. But we have to manage, right? Because managers focus on planning, organizing, directing, controlling. We all have schedules. We all have to make sure that our employees meet these deadlines. Yes, we focus on things. We have to focus on doing it right. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. But at the same time, in order to make sure we're meeting those deadlines and those schedules, we have to inspire, influence, motivate. And we already know that when employees feel safe, they're more apt to work faster and better and with more quality than if they feel unsafe. They're going to be unsure. They're not going to meet our deadlines. So safety does not slow down production. In fact, studies have shown that when employees feel safe and comfortable and have a good relationship with their managers and supervisors, production actually improves because everyone's on the same page and they feel taken care of. There was a survey done about 10 years ago. UC Berkeley did a survey of 54,000 employees. And when we look at the characteristics of a leader, look, integrity was number one. People don't want their leaders to be courageous. I find that kind of interesting that that's the very last one. But employees said, look, I want my manager, my supervisor, my leadership to have high integrity. And if they do, I will follow them everywhere. So integrity, if I tell you something, you can believe me. When I was a corporate safety manager, we had lasers, we had toxic gases. I knew that when I told an employee it was safe to go in a laser lab, it was safe to go in a room that had toxic gases, when they went in, they knew that if Kathy told me it was so, it must be so. They trusted me, and I was humbled by their trust. If you are not humbled by the trust that your employees put in you, when you have them do something that might be hazardous, and they look at you and they trust you, that is a humbling experience. And that's why I say there's nothing better than being a safety leader in an organization. Because when we think of integrity, what does it look like? I think it looks like trust. Trust means that your employees are going to know that you will keep their safety in mind at all times, that you know their families, you know their kids. And I'm just going to share one thing with you. There is a motivational speaker. His name is Dave Mitchell. You can look him up. He's written many, many books. I have to give him credit for this. I wish I knew this when I was a safety manager. And what he had us all do, I was in a room about 600 people. He had us all write down the 4 people in our lives that would be affected if we got hurt on the job. 4 people. Mom, dad, kids, spouse, whoever it is. And he said, what would your safety culture look like that instead of me saying, hey, Deb, put on your safety glasses. Hey, Bob, you know what? Slow down on that forklift. What if the safety culture said, hey, Deb, as she's not wearing her safety glasses, I called her attention and just held up 4 fingers. And all of a sudden, Deb knows, you know what? That's not all about me. Kathy's looking out for my 4. Hey, Bob, slow down. I'm holding up 4 fingers. Bob knows. Instead of taking it personally, mind your own business. Oh, yeah, it's my 4. She's looking out for my 4. So maybe at your next staff meeting, you have your employees write down those 4 people. And if you create a safety culture where employees are reminding each other of their 4, that is a huge success. Integrity is an understanding and empathy. Maybe knowing they've had a bad day. There are major deadlines. It's the 10th hour of a shift, and we're all trying to get this out. It's the end of the quarter. You're rolling up your sleeves. You're right there with them. That's huge. And integrity means knowing you know what makes them tick. They know that you see them as a human being, not just a schedule on a piece of paper. That's what safety and integrity looks like. How do we do this? Motivation by celebration, making safety a routine part of every decision that you make. We're still in that moral piece, right? It's the start of your safety culture. You're recognizing safe behaviors, right? Recognizing safe behaviors. Bob, thank you for helping Deb. Jim, thank you so much for helping Steve pick up that load. You did that all on your own. Hey, I know you're new here. We don't work that way. This is a team effort. Let me help you. That's when you know you've got a good safety culture. And if we learn from safety leaders, my business partner, Steve Thompson, wrote a book here in San Diego with Dan Hopwood. Also here in San Diego, they interviewed a lot of safety leaders. And a couple things is lessons from safety leaders here, showing people you care usually spurs them on to better safety performance. We talked about them being human beings. If you think of the Hawthorne study that was done in the 1920s, very quickly women were taken off a production line, again, before labor laws, before OSHA. And over a period of about 5 years, this researcher really was going to do a study on production, lighting in a production facility. But over this 5-year period, asked them about their job, made some changes based on their feedback, their production went up. Gave them breaks, their production went up. Talked to them about their job, made a few more tweaks, gave them hot meals, their production went up. And these women were asked at the end of the study, why did your production go up? And their sole response was, because someone finally asked us for our input about our job. We were finally asked, what about our job? What's this all about? And people heard us and made changes. That can make a big difference. Lesson 2 is you've got to live these values privately and publicly. Being a safety leader and a profession is a choice. It's not a position. You've got to network with other industries like you, whether or not it's hospitals, construction, roofing associations, nonprofits. You want to know what other companies are doing like yours. It's being visible and viable. It's setting an example. And I'm going to tell you this, if your company requires safety glasses out on that production floor, you better, as a manager, supervisor, HR director, owner of the company, you better have your safety glasses on when you're out there, because you're going to lose their level of respect if you don't. And 3 is have your employees make a commitment to safety. Maybe at your next safety meeting, when they write down who their 4 are, have them write down the 3 things they're going to do to remain safe on the job, right? I will wear my safety glasses. I will drive the speed limit on my way to work. I will wear sunblock when I work outside. Whatever that is, somehow when we write it down, we're more apt to follow those causes, or those our own kind of set of rules. So when we think about what does cause accidents, we talked about the moral. Now let's kind of look at, well, what does cause accidents? I took this picture myself. It was a guy standing on a scaffold, taking a risk, very unsafe behavior, fixing the A in Plaza, kind of doing Pilates. I didn't notice there was a Pilates sign under his scaffold until I actually pulled it up on my computer, because he kind of looks like he's doing Pilates. But he's taking a risk. He's about 20 feet up in the air. Why is he doing this? Well, this was a Sunday about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. My guess is that scaffold was about to be moved underneath those three windows. Somebody said, hey, look, you've got to fix the A in Plaza, or the word plaza doesn't quite look right. And instead of making sure that scaffold was right, he just crawled up that scaffold, wanted to get it done. You know, he crawled up those cross braces. There's no ladder there, but he took a risk. And that's an unsafe behavior. For him, it was a rational behavior. And we have to know, why is it rational? Why did he do this? That's irrational behavior, but to him, it was rational. Sorry, I had to cough. So when we think about a definition of a hazard, right? Well, it's a workplace condition that can cause an injury or illness. But then we have to ask ourselves, just because a hazard exists, will someone necessarily have an accident or incident, right? Well, the definition of an exposure, right, means that someone has a susceptibility to a workplace hazard or condition. So when people are exposed to a hazard, the potential for an accident or incident exists. So bottom line is, in order for an incident to happen, or in order for us to prevent someone from getting hurt, that hazard has to be removed or eliminated, or the exposure to that hazard has to be controlled. So just because you have a loading dock that's 4 feet off the ground that is supposed to be protected, just because it's there doesn't mean that an employee is going to fall off. If you have a barrier there, if you've put a control, that person's not going to get hurt. But if you have an uncontrolled hazard, then someone could get hurt. So all I'm saying here is, just because there's a hazard in your workplace doesn't necessarily mean someone's going to get hurt. They have to be exposed to that hazard, i.e., we can protect them from that exposure, or we can eliminate that exposure altogether. So what are the factors that create hazards? People, equipment, materials, and processes are people. They take risks, and I love these pictures, right? Distracted walking is an epidemic. Distracted driving is an epidemic. People, we create our own hazards. We're not paying attention. We do jobs that we're not properly trained for, or we as supervisors put our employees doing jobs that we haven't properly trained them to do. Equipment creates hazards because they're not maintained. They're not up to date. They don't have the right guards, or we didn't put the guards on when we put the equipment out on the floor. Materials might be loose. They're not stored properly. They're stored too high. Their heavy items are at the top instead of the bottom. The environment can cause hazards. It's hot, it's cold, it's windy, it's loud. There's vibration. It's crowded. Forklifts are too fast. And the process itself, we're not thinking through the process. Walk through your process. How many times is the product touched and put on a shelf and put back on the conveyor belt and packed and moved? Can we eliminate some of the process to reduce the hazards? So when we look at hazards, they're usually broken down into unsafe conditions and unsafe behaviors. An unsafe condition is a condition in the workplace that can cause property damage or injury, i.e., unsecured compressed gas cylinders, fluid on the floor, boxes in the aisleways, poor housekeeping, open file drawers, cords across the floor, overloaded electrical plugs. Unsafe condition, easy enough. But how do they get there? By unsafe behavior. Someone didn't secure that compressed gas cylinder. Someone spilled liquid and didn't pick it up. Someone overloaded that circuit. Now you know why. If we concentrate on the unsafe behaviors, the unsafe conditions will go away. So that's why 80 to 85% of unsafe behaviors are what causes accidents. Concentrate on why employees behave the way they do, and I will tell you, your your accidents will be reduced. Celebrate the positives. Your accidents will be reduced. Now, these are my friends at Solar Turbine. They did allow me to use this one slide because the books say 80 to 85% of unsafe behaviors cause the injuries, and they looked at over 1,900 injuries, and it's interesting. They came up with 78% of their injuries were caused by unsafe behaviors. Close enough. Concentrate on controlling those unsafe behaviors. Your injuries are going to go down. How do we know if they're unsafe behaviors, unsafe conditions? Well, you're out there, you're observing, you're rolling up your sleeves. The first time I gowned up and went into our fab, which is the clean room, our production facility, my predecessor never went in the fab. I didn't know that you could recognize people by just their eyes because that's the only thing I could see. And after 5 years, I was able to actually recognize people just by their eyes because I went in there. And I said, I cannot protect you from hazards unless I do the job too. So you're out there. Employees are telling you that there are hazards. You're doing your scheduled inspections. You're learning about hazards through your accident investigations. Remember, for every incident that's listed on your OSHA log, OSHA expects you to have an accident investigation form. Looking at records, looking at maintenance schedules. Remember, if there's a piece of equipment that's involved in an accident, the first thing everybody's going to ask for are those maintenance records. And maybe doing a job hazard analysis, taking some of your most hazardous jobs, breaking them up into manageable steps, identifying the hazard to that step, and then identifying the control of the hazard to that step. Very easy ways to identify and recognize hazards before something happens. So we've talked about the moral, kind of the legal, and now the financial impact. So I want to talk to you just very briefly, this is a 10,000-foot view level of the true cost of the financial impact of when an employee gets injured. Of course, it's the moral issues first. We want them to take care of their families, but what's the cost to the company? As supervisors, managers, we have to know that big picture. When we think of the true cost, and those of us in safety kind of look at an injury as like an iceberg. Only 10% of that iceberg is above water. The 90% is below. The 10% of an injury are the tangible costs, right? It's the medical treatment, the physical therapy, the bill that the doctor gets or that the insurance company gets. But don't forget there's non-tangible costs. Your time taking that accident investigation, the breakup of a crew, the loss of production, right? There's some ish numbers that go along with it. Now, for those of you that are communicators that like precise, this is kind of an ish overview to give you an idea of the truer cost of accidents. So one way of doing it, Liberty Mutual came up with this sliding ratio. When I first started in safety about 30 years ago, we'd say, just take that tangible cost, multiply it by 4, and that gives you the true cost. Well, Liberty Mutual says, look, you can do it this way. You can take the direct cost times the cost multiplier, i.e. if my injury was $1,500, let's say the laceration, indirect cost is 4.5, gives me the indirect, add the direct and indirect together, I get the true cost. So here's an example, $1,500 laceration. Doesn't seem so bad, does it? Big deal, no lost time, a little bit of modified duty, I'm back to work in a week, everything's great. When we use this formula, that $1,500, the true cost is about $8,000, right? $8,250. Why do we say it's not $1,500? Well, how does workers' compensation work? Part of that is the supervisor's time and the non-tangible time. But remember that experience modification rate is based on the cost of that injury, that reserved amount, that cost. And remember, because it stays on that actuarial calculation for 3 years, we kind of say, look, that $1,500 is being paid for over a 3-year period, if you will. So for all of you whose insurance renewed in 2017, well, if that $1,500 laceration occurred in 2013, I'm still paying for that, if you will. That's still considered part of my experience modification rate calculation in 2017. It's not going to fall off until 2018. So that's why we say, look, there's more than just $1,500 here. It's part of our our statistics and actuarial calculation for a long period of time. And if we think of it just in pure increase in premium, we can kind of look at our profit margin. So if you want to know what your profit margin is, you take the truer cost, 8,250 divided by whatever profit margin your company has, and that will tell you the revenue required to pay for that injury. Now, of course, there's workers' compensation, but let's just change the wording and say, what if your insurance increased by $8,250, right? Just like auto insurance, you have a lot of accidents, your auto insurance goes up, well, so does your workers' comp. So if your workers' compensation went up by $8,250 one year over the next at a 3% profit margin, you're going to have to bring in $275,000 worth of revenue to pay for that $8,000 increase. And if your profit margin is only 1%, it's $825,000 that you have to bring in just to pay for that increase in revenue of increase in cost of $8,250. So, do injuries impact the bottom line? You bet they do. There's a huge cost. And of course, there's all different kinds of insurance, traditional first dollar, there's self-insured for large companies, self-insured retention. There's captive programs where, like employers kind of pool their resources, share in the loss history. And then of course, there's insurance pools. A lot of, schools, again, entities pool their resources. So bottom line is, regardless, when insurance premiums go up, there's a lot of revenue that has to come in to pay for that. So as we wrap up, and then Deb, I'll take a pause and see if there's any questions. At the end of the day, you are a safety leader, whether it's a moral bucket, a legal bucket when it comes to OSHA, or the financial bucket to control the costs that go out the door for increase in premium, that we'd rather go into increase in equipment and tools and payroll and bonuses and benefits. So I love this quote. Anybody who's been a manager for an hour knows that courage is being scared to death, but saddling up anyway. We come to work, we roll up our sleeves, we make it happen. So when we think of being a safety leader, I want you to really be proud. You are a visionary. You have to know where the company is going, right? You have to know the true vision of the company. If you aren't positive about the vision, no one's going to want to follow you. I always say, if you're Eeyore, right, the world's coming to an end, it's very hard to follow an Eeyore. Be a visionary. Know it's going to get better. Maybe you've had a tough loss year. Maybe you're going to rally your resources, rally your team, and say, what can we do better? How can we look out for each other? Hey, I have an idea. Let's everybody write down their 4. Let's start looking out for each other because of our 4. You are a role model. You wear safety glasses. You drive the forklift within speed limits. You do make sure that at work and outside of work, if any of your employees see you driving, you're not texting and driving, you're driving the speed limit. And you are a manager. You have to manage. You have production schedules. You have things that have to get done. Of course, you're a leader. You're a safety leader, but it's okay to manage. You are a mentor. How many of us are in our current jobs because somebody else believed that we could do this job? I know that I am. Someone thought that I might be a good safety professional. It never crossed my mind. I was going to get on the fire department. I was going to have a career doing something totally different. I spent 8 years in the Coast Guard. I went, wait a minute. If I can protect stevedores and my fellow Coast Guardsmen and the community from 20,000 tons of explosives, I love this. I can do this job. You are a mentor, coach, and mentor. Think of succession planning. Who's going to take your job when you retire or you move on? And you are a protector. You are protecting your employees, sometimes from themselves, sometimes from each other, but you are making sure that their families are taken care of. What do we do next? Well, maybe you conduct a job hazard analysis for key jobs. Don't be overwhelmed. Pick the 3 or 4 most hazardous jobs your employees do. Break it down into manageable steps. Identify the hazard of that step and the current control of that step. Look at engineering controls, right? That's, if you can't eliminate it, the hierarchy is engineering, i.e. guards, interlocks, things like that, automatic shutoffs. Second is administrative controls, policies, procedures, and the last level of control is always personal protective equipment. Not that you're not going to wear PPE when it comes to chemical use and things like that, but look, if there's a chemical exposure, can you engineer out the exposure before throwing a respirator on somebody? Review your employee training records. Have they been trained on the hazards of their job? Can they recognize hazards or unsafe conditions? If they can't, you need to do some retraining. I want you to think of a way to celebrate safe behaviors. Maybe it is, we're going to bring in pies for the team if we catch 10 employees being safe, 30 employees being safe. If we have an increase of 10% in our training attendance records, we're going to celebrate safety somehow. Conduct regular inspections. Get your employees involved. You don't have to do everything. Provide feedback. Ask your employees how you're doing. Oh, that's a risk that you have to be willing to take. Sometimes we think we're a wonderful communicator, and maybe we're not. Maybe we're not spending enough time in one department. I know for me, we had a swing shift that came in at 4 o'clock until about 1 in the morning. Oh, I had to kind of put that on my calendar to make sure that they felt that I was there for them as well. It wasn't easy. It took me a while, but I had to put it on my calendar. Provide feedback, make improvements, ask how you're doing, then ask again. Because at the end of the day, whether you have one person responding or reporting to you or 100, you are saving their life. You are preventing injuries and illnesses, and you are protecting your company from financial harm. And Deb, that's all I have for today. If there's any questions, we are pretty much right on time. Let me know if there's any questions.
Thank you, Kathy. We do have a few questions, and thank you for such an enthusiastic presentation. Your passion for this subject is very evident, and I'm sure the audience appreciates that. So the very first question is, how do I know if I'm Cal OSHA or federal OSHA or otherwise? If I'm in California, must I be Cal OSHA?
Oh, that's a great question, and thank you for asking me to clarify. If you are a company in California, you're Cal OSHA. You do not have to worry about Fed OSHA. Unless you're on a military base or an Indian reservation, you are Cal OSHA. Any states outside of California are either managed by Fed OSHA or the state manages Fed OSHA guidelines or regulations. But if you are a California company located in California, it's only Cal OSHA. You do not have to worry about Fed OSHA regulations. Now, one thing to think about, and certainly there are a few exceptions, and I'm certainly happy to talk offline. Most companies that have locations in California and outside of California will have their outside of California companies follow Cal OSHA rules, i.e. the Injury and Illness Prevention Program is only a requirement in California. It exceeds all the other requirements for safety management programs in every other state. Fed OSHA was going to adopt the IIPP, calling it the I2P2. Oh my goodness gracious. And they didn't. So if you have company or locations outside of California, you implement your IIPP outside of California, you are exceeding Fed OSHA guidelines for a management safety system. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you, Kathy. I think I saw I2P2 in the last Star Wars movie. Okay. Are there any reporting standards that you can suggest on reporting concerns to upper management?
Reporting standards? Is that what the question was?
Yes, reporting standards. So it looks like maybe there's some concern about some things that are happening in maybe a template or some type of reporting document that would be used on a consistent basis to go to upper management.
Yep, good question. So California, and this probably isn't a bad thing to do outside of California as well, requires, the IIPP says that you have to have some form of anonymous notification that employees can communicate safety concerns. Now, I always say that hopefully you have a culture where maybe you have a employee suggestion box, certainly in a lunchroom. Hopefully you have a culture where your employees feel that they can go to you directly. But Cal OSHA says, look, you have to have an anonymous notification system. Maybe you have forms in the employee lunchroom. Maybe there's an anonymous email system that can go into the safety department where someone is looking at these. So you can do a simple template. These are my concerns. This is where I saw it. This is the date that I saw it. And you have to have a mechanism in place that employees can and report safety concerns anonymously. It doesn't matter how you do it. It can be hard copy, it can be email, as long as it's anonymous. And that's all I have for that.
Oh, thank you, Kathy. Regarding the next question, that makes a nice dovetail. Do you have any templates that you can share as it pertains to general checklists and things like that?
You know what? Sure. And if you would like, you know, there's general. Look, here, and I do, and I'm happy to share them. You know, I've got things for garages, just general office. Here's what's easy. For a general checklist, and it's a living, breathing document, here's what you want to do. You want to look at life safety. You want to look at trip and fall hazards. You want to make sure that cords are not overloaded. You want to make sure that fire extinguishers aren't blocked, that they've been checked on a monthly basis. If you have a production facility, you know, maybe break it down into areas, the shop, the chemical storage, and you're just identifying potential areas where there could be a hazard. Now remember, this is a method and a system, so any checklist has to have a space on it that says you identified a hazard and then when that hazard was corrected. Okay, so it's a living, breathing document. You keep it for 3 years, then you get rid of it. You do not want to keep them longer than 3 years. Because if OSHA comes in and is 4 years old and they see a hazard that supposedly was fixed, now it could be considered a willful. So you can create your own locations, break it down into manageable chunks. Now, here's what I want to say about inspections. The IIPP just says that employers have to do periodic inspections. The IIPP is a performance-based standard versus a specification standard. Regulations that are specification standards, i.e. are like fall protection that says at this height, employees must be protected this particular way. The IIPP is a performance-based standard which says, OSHA says, okay, employer, you tell us how you will perform. So the regulation says employers will do periodic inspections. Your IIPP has to be specific though. Maybe your IIPP says, we will do annual inspections in the office and monthly inspections in the warehouse. That's reasonable. But they will hold you accountable for what you say you are going to do. So while we're on the subject of inspections, I've looked at IIPPs and I've seen we're going to do weekly inspections in our warehouse. Well, that means that if OSHA comes on site, they're going to ask for the last 52 weeks of inspections. So it's reasonable that a warehouse is only inspected monthly. If you want to do it twice a month, 3 times a month, that's fine. But if you put down monthly, which is reasonable, OSHA's only going to ask you for the last 12, not the last 52. So make it doable, make it manageable. I certainly can send templates, but that's very easy. Break it down into quadrants, identify the hazard, identify when it was fixed, keep it for 3 years, then get rid of it.
Thank you, Kathy. We may only have time for 1 or 2 more questions. If we do not get to your questions during this webinar, we want to be mindful of your other obligations and end promptly at 11 o'clock. We will be following up with answers by email, and then keep in mind that this webinar has been recorded, so probably about this time next week you'll be able to find the recording on our website so that you can listen to it again. And let's go to the next question. Does OSHA require management safety training?
Yes. So as I mentioned, if OSHA will not only look at the safety training records of your employees, but they will look for safety training records of the managers and supervisors who are supervising those employees. So specifically, if you have employees that use chemicals, that drive forklifts, that use, scary machinery, whatever it is, they are going to make sure that the manager's name is on those training records, because they specifically, and it says in the IIPP in California specifically, again, supervisors must be trained in the hazards of their employees' job duties. So if they will say you cannot effectively supervise the safety of an employee unless that manager has gone through that safety training too. So don't skip training. It's not just for your employees. Plus, it also shows teamwork.
Thank you, Kathy. One last question, and then I'll thank everybody for attending today. Should all companies in California post Proposition 65?
No, you don't have to post. It's really complicated, and it's something I would have to look up again. The whole warning, there's lead everywhere. There are guidelines on when you're required to post Prop 65 signage, and off the top of my head, I don't have that detailed information. A lot of it's on the internet. You can certainly look it up. You could just, on a safe side, is kind of out of the OSHA scope. It's more of a community right to know versus an employee right to know. Community right to know laws were passed after Bhopal, India in the mid-90s, so it's more of a community right to know law than an employee right to know law, because employee right to know for chemicals is under the Hazard Communication Standard. So I'd have to look it up.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and thank you everyone for attending the webinar today. I hope you enjoyed the enthusiasm that was delivered today. We also have another webinar coming up next week on September 20th called Workers' Compensation Update and Practices, and it will be relevant for this current update. So if you haven't already registered, you can register on our website, and I appreciate everybody attending today. Have a wonderful day.